Countless trains have come and gone over the past 2 centuries, with some classes including hundreds of reliable members in working order, while others have been lost to time as fallen legends or faded into obscurity. Yet the least known type of them all are the various engines that never even left the drawing boards, with some classes being minor adjustments to existing ones, while others were mega projects that would have changed the face of railroading. Today, we'll be looking at some of these canceled designs from some of the greatest manufacturers in this episode of Unbuilt. After starting the series off strong with the legendary electromotive diesel, it's only right to cover the various classes of engines from EMD's fierce rival next, General Electric. Although they're mostly known for their diesels, GE is technically older than EMD by a few decades, as they initially constructed numerous classes of electric engines that ran on third rail or overhead wires for use through tunnels starting in 1904, thus being decades ahead of its time. But in regard to diesels, GE started off by assisting their competitor Alco in developing their early diesel engines before finally splitting off as their own diesel locomotive manufacturer in 1956 with the Universal series of engines, with their first few models being export engines for use outside the US in countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa, with many of these classes running on narrow gauge instead of the standard 4-foot 8.5 inches. It's among this initial introduction of 9 export models that we have our first unbuilt class, namely the U4B of 1956, with U denoting the Universal series and commonly nicknamed as the U-boats, 4 for 400 horsepower, and B for the B-B 4-axle wheel arrangement. The lowest number in GE's naming system was almost identical to the U6B and cab switcher, with the primary difference being the U4B was powered by the 8-cylinder Cat 375 prime mover, which produced a relatively minuscule 400 horsepower. Even though the 2 end cab switchers were designed for smaller railroads with tight curves, every railroad preferred the 700 horsepower U6B class to the U4B, as one of the first of many examples among diesel locomotive classes to be directly affected by go big or go home practices, in which several engine classes were cancelled in favor of almost identical higher horsepower counterparts, as the U4B was soon replaced in GE's catalog by the identical U5B with 600 horsepower. More unusual was the case of the U10B or U10C, with C denoting the C-C 6-axle wheel arrangement, in which these two classes were listed in GE's initial catalog as a placeholder of an upgraded U9B and U9C, in which the only modification made would be re-rating the prime mover to produce 1075 horsepower instead of 990 HP. Even though this minute difference wasn't enough to justify them as their own classes, the U10B designation would be used again, as it would later represent an end cab model similar to the U6B instead of the proposed center cab model, as well as another U10B center cab variant for Renfe in Spain. Further up in numbering order, we have a 4-in-1 that underscores the go big or go home trend of the locomotive designs, as the U15B, U17B, U18B, and U20B, not counting the domestic US version of the U18B, were cataloged in the Universal series of export engines starting in the late 60s, as these were simply 4-axle variants of the existing 6-axle classes with the same numbers, followed by a C instead of B, as the U20B was supposed to be re-rated variants of the U18B. With horsepower ranging between 1500 and 2000 among the 4 classes, the 4-axle variants were meant to provide a lighter load on the rails and to compete with other 4-axle diesels on the market, as EMD's go-to 4-axle export engine, the G12, is just rated for 1250 horsepower. However, GE's clients still utilize the 6-axle variants of these engines due to better ride quality, and to account for the various geographic differences with each of the countless railroads that utilize Universal Series engines. Meanwhile, back in the States, where we'll remain for the rest of the episode, we finally cover our first American exclusive design that isn't a simple re-rated engine, as the U15BT and U18BT were proposed as end-cab variants of the popular U18B, as the T denoted transfer unit or switcher, as it directly rivaled EMD's own line of switchers, namely the MP15 series. Although exact drawings of this class exist, they are not readily available online, as they were initially submitted to an edition of Extra 2200 South magazine. I mean, someone did find the drawings, but for some reason the photo doesn't open. But a digital recreation of what this engine could have looked like thankfully is available. This engine would have the same frame as the U-18B, but the cab would be moved forward, thus eliminating the short hood, and the long hood would be lowered to allow for more visibility. Even though this modification wasn't cataloged, the U-18B it was based on was already the lowest horsepower locomotive that GE had to offer in the US, and EMD already dominated the switcher market not just with their new MP15s, but also with the prior SW series. Speaking of lowest available horsepower, GE considered creating an American version of the U-18C and U-20C, which would simply have the design of a U-23C, but with a top horsepower of 1800 and 2000 horsepower respectively. But just like with EMD, many railroads stuck with the go big or go home mindset as they opted for the identical engine classes with higher horsepower, in order to allow for more operating potential when more horsepower would be needed. Speaking of extra horsepower, GE considered making their U-26C Export series with a 16-cylinder prime mover instead of the traditional 12, but this was seen as unviable due to the ongoing worldwide oil crisis, and many railroads simply didn't require an engine that would use a lot more fuel in exchange for just 600 more horsepower when the engines they had could already handle the load. Last in the expansive Universal series is an engine that isn't based on any export models or the traditional U-boats, but rather an experimental class of engines requested by a massive railroad in the US, as GE also proposed the U-56, which was identical to the U-50, but with two 2800 horsepower engines instead of two 2500 horsepower ones, so essentially two U-28s on a single frame. However, the existing U-50 that the proposed class was based on went through a series of maintenance hassles that resulted in Union Pacific losing further interest to develop the class, as GE also discouraged overclocking the two existing GE FDL-16 prime movers. But had this class been built, it would have added another few engines to assist with Union Pacific's need for power, and also would have been one of the strongest locomotives in the world at 5600 horsepower, which is well above most freight engines produced today. That is, until they will be dwarfed by EMD with their DD40AX in 1969 with 6600 horsepower. Upon the start of their solo career by selling the many engines from the Universal series around the world, GE would find more success in the States in the following years, as they developed a new classification system for engines in the States, namely wheel arrangement, top horsepower, and a dash to indicate the decade the model was from, so -7 would indicate the model was designed in the 70s. More specifically, GE continued to develop its reputation with the -7 line of 1977, an official replacement to the Universal series with upgraded electronics, larger radiators, and wider hoods, and better fuel efficiency and mufflers in order to compete with the -2 series from EMD, as GE was starting to work out initial issues with their 7 FDL engine, which was prone to overheating and cracking. The B18-7 was the first engine to be listed in the catalog, to specifically replace the more popular U-18B, as this particular class was the only model to stand out among other classes being offered, as it was the only class that was offered with an 8-cylinder prime mover, namely the GE 7 FDL-8, had the shortest frame at just 56 feet 8 inches long, and offered the least horsepower at 1800 horsepower. The B-18 also stood out from the rest of the 4-axle engines catalog by having the central air blower at the rear, with no intake vents in front of the engine compartment, and some sources even claim that the B18-7 was supposed to have a DC generator. And just like in the past, the B18-7 never received any orders, as it was seen as too weak for increasing freight loads, and now in addition to larger and heavier freight cars, as Class 1s were once again looking for bigger and stronger engines to handle a wide variety of duties. Although this time around, freight railroads were also looking for a general horsepower range for certain types of engines, namely over 2,000 for local and switching service, and over 3,000 for mainline road freight service, as the smaller B23-7 was the preferred switcher model with over 500 examples built, and the two preferred classes of 6-axle power include the C30-7 with over 1,000 examples, and the C36-7 with over 500 examples. Despite the large fleet size of some classes, 0 orders were purchased for the B28-7, which was essentially a B23 with 500 extra horsepower, as well as the B33-7, which was in between the B30-7 and B36-7 with 3,300 horsepower. In regards to 6-axle power, the C23-7 and C28-7 had the same horsepower as their 4-axle counterparts, but no orders were placed in favor of the C30 with 3,000 horsepower, and the C33-7 was also cataloged with no orders due for being in between the C30 and C36, again, just like its 4-axle counterpart. There are also some claims of a C18-7 being considered, not the same class as the C18-7i, built for service in Uruguay almost 20 years later, but its existence is questionable as it did not appear in the official -7 catalog from GE, and common sense also dictates that if a 4-axle diesel engine with 1,800 horsepower didn't sell in 1977, then the likelihood of a 6-axle 8-cylinder engine making any sales at the same time were slim to none. Even though only a handful of the initially cataloged classes made sales, what a difference in railroading they made, as the B23-7 and C30-7 were some of the first classes in GE's history that sold over 500 examples, as the -7 series was given the nickname Super 7, which now made them a serious competitor in the face of EMD. Just 5 years later, GE introduced their -8 series of engines, which introduced new car bodies and the standard cab for all their engines to be cataloged, as they swooped into the market just in time, right after EMD lost their otherwise spotless reputation with the development and commercial flop of the problematic SC50. Even though this resulted in the rise of many prominent 6-axle classes such as the C40-8, only 2 classes from this series resulted in no sales, namely the B23-8 and the C44-8. The former was simply listed in the initial -8 catalog in 1982 to see if any railroads wanted to directly supplement the popular B23-7 from the previous catalog, but at this point, most Class 1s were focused more on heavy-duty 6-axle engines, as all the other catalog 4-axle -8s barely broke 200 units sold, and no railroad was interested in a 4-axle switcher that was a whopping 850 horsepower less than everything else in the catalog. The C44-8, as well as the C44-9 successor, on the other hand, was simply a standard cab variant of the C44-8W, or -844CW, as the larger and safer wide cab was initially an option for new locomotive classes until it became the standard design for all new GE locomotives starting in the early 90s. It is at this point that GE doesn't have any more unbuilt freight engines, in which every engine class they offered at this point had an increasing number of sales, as ever since EMD's blunder with the SD50 in 1980, General Electric has always remained as the top freight locomotive builder for North America and the rest of the world based on their efficiency. GE had won. But whereas GE is now the king of freight engines, they didn't always uphold the title for passenger locomotives in the face of international competition in the States. Just 10 years after the success of the Genesis series of passenger engines that became the face of Amtrak by replacing the iconic EMD F40PH, the same designer of the Genesis, Cesar Vergara, drafted sketches for the next generation passenger locomotive, or P44-AC, specifically in response to an important contract opportunity in Canada, according to his website vergarastudio.com. Although I can't find many official proposals as to what this contract opportunity could be from the early 2000s, it could simply be a bid to replace the rest of the remaining F40s on Via Rail outside of their corridor, though this is just speculation. This design was essentially a Genesis with a rounded roof, a more rounded nose for better crashworthiness, and most notably with 3 front windows instead of 2, along with some variation in headlight locations, which based on other engines that GE was producing around this time, could have very well been an Evolution series version of the Genesis, or a Gevo Genesis of sorts. Although, little information can be found about its development elsewhere, despite concept photos of this engine occasionally floating around online. Although while trying to research this topic, I did find a 2010 article from Christian Science Monitor that claimed that GE was not only interested in developing the next generation passenger locomotive that could reach 125 miles per hour, but that it also planned to create its own electric engine in association with China's Ministry of Railways. This comes around the same time when GE and CRRC decided to develop a joint bid for future high-speed rail projects across the US, notably for California and Florida. CRRC would have likely sent a modified version of one of many high-speed train set designs that were in use at China at the time, but if they would have developed an electric locomotive, then I assumed this collaborative design might have resulted in a variant of the China Railways Class HXD-1C, as it was the most recent electric locomotive designed by CRRC at the time in 2009. But if the originally mentioned next-gen passenger engine wasn't the Genesis 2, as it was dubbed, then it could have also been our next entry, the B40-8 which for all intents and purposes is simply a 6-axle MPI HSP-46 intended to rival against the Siemens Charger. Even though the basis was built by Motive Power Industries, or MPI for MBTA, Boston's commuter railroad, the design was still listed as a GE product, with the unusual and less flexible 6 axles being the only difference between the two designs. It's also interesting to note that the P-47's proposed livery is an identical match to the original livery of the Avelia Liberty, or a Acela 2 train set built by Alstom that was first released in 2016. But due to reliability issues with the HSP-46 and with the great performance of the Siemens ACS-64, Amtrak ultimately chose the Siemens SC-44 Charger as a replacement for the GE Genesis, as the Charger was essentially a diesel version of the ACS-64. Although, the passenger section of GE's unbuilt engines wouldn't be complete without GE's very own high-speed train, somewhat, named by Mr. Vergara as the Amtrak NEC Next-Gen High-Speed Train Set. Ever since the 1990s, Amtrak was looking at a variety of high-speed train set designs upon several improvements in the Northeast Corridor, including electrification to Boston. Although this was designed while Cesar Vergara worked for Amtrak in 1990, likely being one of the first train set projects that the legendary designer worked on, the overall design looks very similar to the iconic GE Genesis designed around the same time, so it's assumed that GE would have likely built this train set as well had it come to fruition. Several scale models of this train set were made in different liveries, but Amtrak ultimately went with a joint Bombardier and Alstom order for the American Flyer, later the Acela a few years later. Whether GE would have actually been selected to build this high-speed train or not, solely based on its design, is debatable, but it's more than fitting to end the passenger section with a proposed high-speed train, just like the previous episode. Although, before we move into the Fairbanks Morse section of this video, there is an important bit of GE's history in passenger engines that was skipped over in order to keep continuity with the previous section, namely towards the end of individual passenger engines just before the formation of Amtrak. During the late 60s and early 70s, GE and EMD were offering passenger variants of existing freight engines, so this way they could easily be converted for freight service upon the anticipated discontinuance of passenger trains in the US, with GE's two most notable examples being the U-30CG and U-28CG for the Santa Fe. But over the years, and notably with the Universal and 7 series of their engines, GE offered passenger variants of every single model in their catalog, with the only difference being the addition of a steam heater or head-end power generator. Since all of these classes have virtually the same difference, the full list of unbuilt passenger variants includes the following: U-23CG, U-25BG, U-33CG, U-36CG, B18-7H, BQ18-7H, B23-7H, BQ23-7H, B28-7H, BQ28-7H, B30-7H, BQ30-7H, B30-7AH, BQ30-7AH, C18-7H, CQ18-7H, C23-7H, CQ23-7H, C28-7H, CQ28-7H, C30-7H, CQ30-7H, C30-7H, CQ30-7AH, B33-7H, BQ33-7H, B36-7H, BQ36-7H, C33-7H, CQ33-7H, C36-7H, and CQ36-7H. But if you listen closely, you might have noticed that a handful of entries involved Q in the name. Since G denotes steam generator while H denotes HEP, and B denotes 4 axles, C denotes 6 axles, A denotes AN, and U denotes the Universal Series, what could Q possibly stand for? This, as some may fear, denotes the infamous quarters cab, an enclosed box-shaped cab that could hold up to 5 crew members in order to replace the caboose. Even though just 10 examples were built as they were fitted on the B23-7s with no examples in preservation, GE also offered the Q cab variant for every single model in their catalog during the 70s, meaning that there's also an entire list of Q cab variants for the -7 series. This includes the BQ18-7, BQ23-7, BQ28-7, BQ30-7, BQ30-7A, BQ33-7, BQ36-7, CQ18-7, CQ23-7, CQ28-7, CQ30-7, CQ30-7A, CQ33-7, and CQ36-7, in addition to the aforementioned passenger variants with Q cabs. Although there isn't too much concept art of these Q cabs on almost identical -7s, a fan of this channel made renderings of not only what some of these engines would look like, but also what would have happened had GE adopted the Q cab design and made it standard for all future models. Now that nightmare is over, Fairbanks Morse was one of the larger manufacturers of various appliances throughout the early 20th century, just like General Electric, with a specific reputation for excellent marine engines, but they didn't enter the locomotive market until the 1930s. Naturally, they decided to utilize their successful marine engines in their locomotives, which made for some pretty reliable and innovative products, as some of their engines, namely the Unbuilt, were built in GE's Erie, Pennsylvania factory, as many of them were also built with GE electronics, hence why they're included in this episode of Unbuilt. Also like GE, the few examples of unbuilt classes are very similar to other engines cataloged by FM, with some exceptions, starting with a small branch of the consolidation line, or Sealiner series, which looks the most similar to the Unbuilt class. Some Sealiners unusually had 5 axles, and the class to be focused on was the CFA-24-4, meaning that these were engines in the consolidation line intended for freight service with 2400 horsepower, a considerably high amount for the time, as well as 4 axles instead of 5. Although, they would have been identical to literally any of the other 4-axle Sealiners in the series, and 24 horsepower with 12-cylinder engines likely would have been too much power when compared to other variants that only provided 2000, especially seeing that this was proposed in the early 50s and freight trains weren't too long back then. Meanwhile, the rest of the entries are part of FM's Road Switcher series, where each class would have an H, followed by its horsepower and number of wheels. With that said, the next entry, the H844, would have just 800 horsepower and 4 axles, but this class didn't have any orders in favor of other switchers that had just a little more horsepower, namely the H1044, which was FM's first cataloged model to gain sales. Speaking of small horsepower, FM also planned on selling export units of their Trainmaster series of switchers to places other than Canada, with options for 600 or 800 horsepower with either 4, 5, or 6 axles, as they were listed as the H644, H646, H666, H844, H846, and H866. Although, these plans never materialized, and the only FMs that went outside of the US and Canada were those that were sold to various roads in Mexico secondhand, most notably the Chihuahua al Pacifico. Afterwards, we start to get into the increasingly unusual listings from FM, starting off small with the H16-64, which is basically a 5-axle version of the H1644, but most railroads preferred either having 2 3-axle trucks or 2 2-axle trucks, usually not a mix of both. Up next is the H2066, or mid-size Trainmaster as I call it, which would have been the only 6-axle FM engine with an end cab instead of a non-center cab, which would have limited its visibility, and it was once again stuck in the middle between a higher and lower horsepower variant that sold more units, thus rendering this class unneeded as well. Unusually, FM proposed a cow-calf articulated H1244 set with 3 trucks, in which a H1244 set was permanently attached to a B unit, which likely would have only been used for shunting in massive yards, but the articulated configuration would have limited the set to certain duties, as the A unit cannot be separated from the B unit, which is also why most slugs in B units are never permanently articulated with the cab unit. While in the Trainmaster series, there are reports of a Trainmaster styled passenger unit in the late 50s while the company tried to enter the passenger engine market, but little to no info is known about this particular model. Last but not least is the mighty H3466, the Super Trainmaster, with a whopping 3,400 horsepower in a time where some of the strongest engines at the time only had 1,800 horsepower, thus doubling the amount offered by competitors by supercharging the FM 1238D8 prime mover. But despite its sheer awesomeness, railroads at the time didn't have the need for such unspeakable power at the time, and it likely would have helped the company just a few years later, but this design was being developed at the same time as when FM went through a proxy battle with Penn, Texas. This ultimately resulted in many railroads canceling orders for FM locomotives, as more of them were eventually retired due to lack of available parts. Although Fairbanks Morse is still around today, as they continue to work on their specialty of marine engines, as they continue to keep their overall legacy alive and well to this day, constantly evolving for the needs of the time. But one can only imagine what the world would have been like if FM were to make more models into the 60s or beyond, or if they were to even return to the locomotive market one day. Are there any unbuilt GE or FM engines that I missed in this episode, or are there other unbuilt engines that you would like to see covered in the series? Feel free to comment below, and I'll see where they can best fit in the future episodes. Thank you all for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.